You focus a lot on the e-meter specifically, this device that's very central to Scientology. Tell me about why you decided to keep coming back to that, and just a little bit about how it works. And I understand it does work to some extent.
It does. I mean, the e-meter is part of auditing, and auditing is a kind of therapy that you practice in Scientology, where at least initially it can have a tremendously purgative effect. But I think the reason I kept focusing on it was I was very interested in Larry's book, you know, and particularly the subtitle, The Prison of Belief, in terms of how very smart people would get into a religion like this, which has been so stigmatized and has all these wacky elements, including, you know, swirling body thetans and Zeno the Galactic Overlord and so forth and so on. But how do you get in at the beginning? And you get in through this therapy. And this therapy, everybody talks about how powerful it was for them. So we keep going back to that because it's both evidence of the power of it, but also how far it gets taken. Because that meter ends up being a force for oppression. Because what they do is they take these, so the church takes these secrets and then use them against their own members in order to force them to do the things that they want to do. It's like telling a priest confession, telling a priest terrible secrets in confession, and then that priest, like a pedophile, using that as a kind of recruiting device for certain children. So it's really very, very, very dangerous.
And also they use the e-meter for what they call security checks.
Right.
And so if they suspect you of being disloyal in some fashion, you're put on the cans, as they say, and they use this as a way of trying to polygraph whether you're telling the truth or not.
Well, in fact, I mean, Scientology has lots of kind of wonderful language, like very odd terms of, you know, operating thetan level. There's a lot of this in your book. You know, you know it better. But what, you know, what is it that leads to that, all of that language?
Well, Hubbard was, you know, a very prolific writer, and but he had a talent for creating new words, neologisms, you know, that expressed what he thought were thoughts that couldn't be contained in ordinary language. And so I think part of the cloistered nature of Scientology is that deeper you get into it, the more that becomes your actual language. And so when people come out of the church, a lot of times they don't know which words are ordinary words and which are Scientology words. There are concepts buried in that vocabulary that most people don't have access to.
When I first started on this project, there were a number of ex-Scientologists I spoke to who weren't willing to come on camera, but they had recently left, and I had to take Lauren Wolf, who's the associate producer of the film, and work with Larry very closely along with me to translate, because having just come out, it was very difficult for me to understand what they were in fact saying. They were speaking English, but the
Hubbard English.
Hubbard English. Yeah. It was really impenetrable.
Yeah. Each of you has studied in your work different religions before. You reported a lot on Al-Qaeda and kind of fundamentalist Islam, and you did a documentary about Catholicism. And I was wondering how this project differed, and also, you know, how it was the same in some ways.
Well, for me, I guess over my whole career, I've written frequently about religions. I started out, my first book was about the Amish, and I wrote about the Jim Jones, and I've written many, many different religious movements. I'm always intrigued by what draws people into these organizations and what they get out of it, and also how, you know, in Scientology, you don't have conversion experiences. It's a process. It's an inculcation. And I'm extremely interested in how very intelligent, sensitive, skeptical people are drawn into this organization and then become completely different from the people they thought they were going to be.
I mean, in the case of, you know, I'm a lapsed Catholic. I made a film about the Catholic Church called Mea Maxima Culpa, and you know, there are some similarities. The priests would always say, you know, if we get them young, we never lose them. And you see in the Scientology experience that once you've been in for a long period of time, it becomes very difficult emotionally to dissociate yourself from the religion. That becomes very, very hard, and it's one of the poignant things, I think, about the testimony in the film. The other aspect of it is the way that sometimes secrets get abused. And I spoke earlier about the confessional. Sometimes in the Catholic Church, it's considered the greatest crime in the Catholic Church to abuse testimony from the confessional. But it's something that is more routinely done in Scientology.
Could you talk a little bit about how the church has changed in the transition from L. Ron Hubbard to David Miscavige?
Sure. Well, Hubbard was the undisputed, founder and the last word in Scientology. His word today is still taken as scripture. And so every single thing that he said is the law. Now this can be difficult because when Hubbard was still alive, he could change things. Now things are frozen. And so there's been factually a purge of some of the Scientology material having to do, for instance, with homosexuals. In Hubbard's, some of his books, he's very disparaging of homosexuality. And some of those words have been taken out. I was asking the former international spokesperson for Scientology, Tommy Davis, about how this had happened. He said, well, we realized that those were words that had been inserted by some unknown force in those original books. We don't know how it happened, but we've taken them out now.
Is that something that's happened in just the last few years? I know that.
Yeah, there's a new edition of periodically there's a vast trove of Scientology books, and then periodically they're reissued and then resold to Scientologists, and it's quite expensive. But Scientology under Hubbard was, it was a closed society, very well contained, difficult to get out of. Under Miscavige, it's become far more oppressive. In the 70s, people talked about how much fun Scientology was. In fact, there was a saying, if it's not fun, it's not Scientology. People don't say that anymore.
One of the more disturbing parts of the documentary is under Miscavige, when you show what it was like for many of the former kind of high officials in the church who were taken to, I'm blanking on the name of it, but
The Hole?
The Hole, yeah. And they were trapped there, and there's a musical chairs, very sick game of musical chairs sequence that they're forced into playing. Could you tell us about that? And
the closest analogy I can think of is Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, where he tried to kind of behead the organization to throw it into total chaos. But in the case of Scientology, some of these people were in there for years in the Hole, which is a couple of double-wide trailers at the Gold Base, which is in Hemet, California. And all these weird psychological games were played on them. And it was an attempt to kind of destabilize them and to really unhinge them so that Miscavige could create an environment in which he had total control.
And it's important to realize that these were the top executives in the church, and supposedly this is a charitable, 501(c)(3) organization which has checks and balances. Well, this is a man who put all of his, his colleagues incarcerated them. Essentially, it's a testament to how thoroughly this is the manifestation of the rule of a single individual.
And it seems it alienated a lot of individuals, many of whom are in the movie and in your book. So I wanted to know where you see the church going forward. Its membership is declining, correct? So 50,000 now?
Well, that's our best.
But I think one of the big things that's really damaged the church, I think, is the internet. Back in the day, before the internet, they were able to create a much more closed society. It was much harder to get information. Now, a few clicks, and you can find this huge amount of stuff about abuses and so forth and so on. And so it's much harder to keep the members inside this bubble in which only Scientology rules.
Although we've talked to so many people who didn't look on the internet because they were told not to. Even Paul Haggis, Academy Award-winning director and writer, until he decided to investigate at the end of his 35 years, he had said he had never heard a single disparaging word about Scientology. And
there's actually a letter which we show in the film. That woman who had to disconnect from her daughter and therefore her granddaughter one of the crimes they accused her husband of, as part of declaring him a suppressive person, was that he had actually gone on the internet. That was the crime. He'd gone on the internet and read critical articles about Scientology.
You ask about the future, and the Scientology has, we think, a very sharply declining membership, and it has a lot of money, billions, and it has a lot of lawyers, but it doesn't have a future if it doesn't change. And there are only a couple of avenues towards reform, I think. One is that the IRS decides to revisit its tax exemption, which allows it to propagate these abuses that we document so well in this movie. And the other is that some of these celebrity megaphones, like Tom Cruise and John Travolta and Kirstie Alley and other people, turn those megaphones in the other direction and demand change and introspection inside the church. If that doesn't happen, then the church is doomed.